comité central du parti de la révolution populaire du Bénin, nous avons répondu présent. Nous sommes venus nombreux fameux et hommes, cadres du Bénin, unifier notre pensée et notre action pour donner à notre chère patrie l'espoir d'une société où il fera bon vivre grâce au socialisme scientifique guidé par le marxisme léniniste. Debout, patriotes béninois, l'enjeu c'est le Bénin démocratique et populaire, c'est la notre devise, c'est la notre serment, la révolution ou la mort, prêt pour la révolution, la lutte continue, la révolution ou la mort, prêt pour la révolution, la lutte continue.
La main dans la main, nous marchons gaiement, prêts pour la révolution. Nous bâtirons plus beau notre patrie, le Bénin, qui grandira dans la paix. En avant, nous sommes engagés. En avant, nous sommes engagés. Jamais dans la vie, nous ne reculerons. Nous remporterons victoire devant vos ennemis et toujours dans la gloire. La main dans la main, nous marchons gaiement, prêts pour la révolution. Nous bâtirons plus beau notre patrie, le Bénin, qui grandira dans la paix. Au travail, peuple béninois. Au travail, peuple béninois. Retroussons les manches, plions les pantalons pour construire le pays. La main dans la main, nous marchons gaiement, prêts pour la révolution. Nous bâtirons plus beau notre patrie, le Bénin, qui grandira dans la paix.
Frères révolutionnaires convaincus, soyons fidèles à notre parti d'avant-garde. Notre parti, c'est le PRPD, parti de la vérité. Mort au trait, au poteau les mercenaires, les impérialistes hors de notre Afrique. Gloire immortelle à notre chère République, la révolution ou la mort. Mobilisons-nous pour les tâches assignées, la production, la construction nationale, la formation patriotique, idéologique, pré-militaire généralisée. Mort au trait, au poteau les mercenaires, les impérialistes hors de notre Afrique. Gloire immortelle à notre chère République, la révolution ou la mort. Quelles que soient les peines et difficultés, quelles que soient les contradictions éventuelles, soyons vigilants, défendons notre patrie et prêts pour la révolution. Mort au trait, au poteau les mercenaires, les impérialistes hors de notre Afrique. Gloire immortelle à notre chère République, la révolution ou la mort.
Chantons notre victoire, béninoise et béninois. Le combat que nous menons est juste, nous ne devons pas échouer. Notre voie très sûre, c'est le socialisme, notre guide le marxisme-léninisme. Nous sacrifierons pour que tu vives, République populaire du Bénin.
Jeunesse béninoise, entends-tu le cri du 30 novembre? Il t'appelle à la vigilance pour défendre ta patrie. Travaillons sans cesse et sans répit pour bâtir un avenir meilleur.
Chantons notre victoire, béninoises et béninois. Le combat que nous menons est juste, nous ne devons pas échouer. Notre voie très sûre est le socialisme, notre guide le marxisme-léniniste. Nous sacrifierons pour que tu vives, République populaire du Bénin.
Paysans béninois, ton signe est le vert de ton drapeau. Ton sol est riche et très fertile au travail pour la production. Conjuguons nos efforts sur la route de l'union qui monte vers l'étoile du bonheur.
Chantons notre victoire, béninoises et béninois. Le combat que nous menons est juste, nous ne devons pas échouer. Notre voie très sûre est le socialisme, notre guide le marxisme-léniniste. Nous sacrifierons pour que tu vives, République populaire du Bénin.
Pour la révolution et la lutte continue, combattant de la liberté, unissons-nous pour la victoire, unissons-nous pour la victoire. Le 26 octobre 72, nous Béninois avons choisi la révolution, révolution qui frère les guerriers et anciens vieux guerriers. À lutter contre le colonialisme, pour sortir notre pays du joug de l'impérialisme. Prêt pour la révolution et la lutte continue, combattant de la liberté. Unissons-nous pour la victoire, unissons-nous pour la victoire. Cette nuit a permis tout vaillant peuple du Bénin de continuer avec un courage le 30 novembre 1974 dans la voie du socialisme soutenu par le marxisme. Debout Béninois et Béninoises pour aller combattre les agresseurs qui tentent de détruire notre nation. Prêt pour la révolution et la lutte continue, combattant de la liberté. Unissons-nous pour la victoire, unissons-nous pour la victoire.
Terre béninoise, oh terre béninoise, terre béninoise, oh terre béninoise, terre béninoise, oh terre béninoise.
Maintenant, petit à ton nom, souverain des batailles. Maintenant, petit à ton nom, souverain des batailles. Tu es purifié, et toute ta vie sera purifiée.
Et nous crions
béninoises, terre béninoise, oh terre béninoise, terre béninoise, oh terre béninoise.
La jeunesse béninoise marche fièrement, remplie de vaillance comme un régiment. Nous sommes des militants et quoique très jeunes, montrons que nous sommes l'espoir de l'Afrique. Pour la révolution,
Nous sommes prêts,
pour la production,
tous en avant.
pour la révolution,
Nous sommes prêts,
pour la production.
tous en avant.
L'école nouvelle rayonne dans le socialisme. L'école nouvelle qui produit vive le marxisme. L'école nouvelle qui forge le Bénin nouveau. L'école nouvelle forgera l'Afrique nouvelle. Pour la révolution,
Nous sommes prêts,
pour la production.
tous en avant.
Pour la révolution,
Nous sommes prêts,
pour la production.
tous en avant.
L'école nouvelle rayonne dans le socialisme. L'école nouvelle qui produit vive le marxisme. L'école nouvelle qui forge le Bénin nouveau. L'école nouvelle forgera l'Afrique nouvelle. Pour la révolution,
Nous sommes prêts,
pour la production.
tous en avant.
Pour la révolution,
Nous sommes prêts,
pour la production.
tous en avant.
Formation idéologique,
Nous sommes prêts,
formation militaire,
tous en avant.
construction nationale,
Nous sommes prêts,
défense de la nation.
tous en avant.
Pour la révolution,
Nous sommes prêts,
pour la production.
tous en avant.
Pour la révolution,
Nous sommes prêts,
pour la production.
tous en avant.
Combattants, aie confiance, un beau jour, plus beau que tous les jours, un long jour, plus long que tous les jours, ouvrira devant toi ses portes, et ce sera, crois-moi bien, le triomphe et la liberté. Combattants, aie confiance, un beau jour, plus beau que tous les jours, un long jour, plus long que tous les jours, ouvrira devant toi ses portes, et ce sera, crois-moi bien, le triomphe et la liberté. Regarde en Guinée-Bissau, plus de 10 ans de lutte acharnée. Les valer. Combattons, aie confiance, un beau jour plus beau que tous les jours, un long jour plus long que tous les jours, ouvrira devant toi ses portes, et ce sera, crois-moi bien, le triomphe et la liberté. Regarde en Guinée-Bissau, plus de 10 ans de lutte acharnée, les forces révolutionnaires ont vaincu, l'impérialisme s'est valé. Combattons, aie confiance, un beau jour plus beau que tous les jours, un long jour plus long que tous les jours, ouvrira devant toi ses portes, et ce sera, crois-moi bien, le triomphe et la liberté. Regarde un peu au Vietnam, 30 ans de guerre, de sacrifices humains, des millions d'âmes ont trouvé la mort, mais aujourd'hui c'est la liberté. Combattons, aie confiance, un beau jour plus beau que tous les jours, un long jour plus long que tous les jours, ouvrira devant toi ses portes, et ce sera, crois-moi bien, le triomphe et la liberté. L'histoire a bien démontré que tout pays qui doit se développer doit se libérer totalement par une révolution décidée de l'impérialisme s'est valé. Combattons, aie confiance, un beau jour plus beau que tous les jours, un long jour plus long que tous les jours, ouvrira devant toi ses portes, et ce sera, crois-moi bien, le triomphe et la liberté. Comme combattons, chimie, et comme ça soulevé, un beau la liberté, beau que tous les jours, tous les jours, un long jour, plus long que tous les jours, ouvrira devant toi ses portes, et ce sera, crois-moi bien, le triomphe et la liberté. Jusqu'au bout, combattants, béninois, pour la production, on ne l'est pas nouvelle, que tous les gens d'égalité, contre le fétichisme, contre l'aspiratisme, vers la révolution, continue, et ce sera, crois-moi bien, le triomphe et la liberté.
Vous avez lutté pour votre liberté. Luttez donc pour votre paix. Citoyen, tu dois prêter serment que tu respecteras fermement. Celui qui a lutté pour ta révolution, sois bien vigilant.
Le 26 octobre, un vent a soufflé et balayé les régimes de démission. Le 26 octobre a sonné pour toi la fin de tes misères et de la domination.
Citoyen, tu dois prêter serment que tu respecteras fermement celui de lutter pour ta révolution. Sois bien vigilant.
Peuple opprimé, peuple béninois, tu es libéré et tu as tout le pouvoir. Ouvriers, paysans, travailleurs, nous lutterons pour garder la réaction.
Citoyen, tu dois prêter serment que tu respecteras fermement celui de lutter pour ta révolution. Sois bien vigilant.
Vois ton salut, tu l'as déjà compris, en optant pour le socialisme. Citoyen, tu dois prêter serment de concrétiser ton total militantisme.
Citoyen, tu dois prêter serment que tu respecteras fermement celui de lutter pour ta révolution. Sois bien vigilant.
Révolution, en avant la victoire. Ouzou, ouzou, mais les mains si ça fort. Mi beauté, béninois en avant. Du courageux, mi bi, mi fort. Révolution, en avant la victoire. Ouzou, ouzou, mais les mains si ça fort. Mimbo tité, béninois en avant. Du courageux, mimbi, mi fond. Bedoupe we mi ja so kudo. Bedoupe we mi ja so kudo me. Mi moteto mbonu pe no pome. Keto le masi ito lo mi chite. Bedoupe we mi ja so kudo. Bedoupe we mi ja so kudo me. Mi moteto mbonu pe no pome. Keto le masi ito lo mi chite.
7 janvier 77, si ya wanre wae.
Minagato yesi.
7 janvier 77, si ya wanre wae.
Minagato yesi.
Onu e manje kojide no jebiji weya.
Minagato yesi.
Kemenu e manje kojide no jebiji weya.
Minagato yesi.
Imperialisme kokolonko si ya wanre wae.
Minagato yesi.
Imperialisme kokolonko si ya wanre wae.
Minagato yesi. Minaga, minaga, minagato yesi. Minaga, minaga, minagato yesi.
Atoto eto àwọn wa na tó bá bene tó rẹ̀.
Onani, Ibatala.
Atoto eto àwọn wa na tó bá domi tó rẹ̀.
Onani, Ibatala.
Mìíràn jáun, mìíràn jáun. Ìbọn bẹ̀mẹ̀ kodu, ìpele fìlà tó bẹ̀mẹ̀ kodu. Ẹ̀dọ̀kú fífún máa jẹ́ ìkòtò.
Turn the mic on. Good evening, one and all, and welcome along to the latest live stream. I hope you have enjoyed the half an hour of music taken from the socialist period from the Republic of Benin, which was, of course, obtained as always, or as often, from the Getchan channel. So if you've not checked that out, be sure to do so. So, who have we got here tonight? Hello to Peter. Hello to my comrade Terry from the Class Consciousness Project. Hello to Harry Price. Hello to Kai. And I'll just make sure the chat settings are correctly applied here. Okay, so tonight, going to be looking at the events in Niger that have taken place over the last few days, including the visit of Victoria Nuland, nobody's favourite State Department official. And then going to be moving on from there to say a little bit on neoconservatism in response to a comment that was made after my comment on neoliberalism. It's the follow-up on that I'll be doing next. And then, of course, I'll be talking a little bit about engineered recessions, which is what we're going to experience in Britain rather soon, if not already, and then concluding by a comment on the American dream, which was prompted by a video that was circulating from Fox News, where a woman in a car is making a video about, well, where did the American dream go? Well, I can tell you where it went, but I'm more interested in tonight in saying, talking a little bit about where it came from, because there's some very interesting things that Karl Marx has to say about where it came from. So, hello to Lee Hinchcliffe, hello to Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk, hello to Rob, hello to Chris Bernardel. So, here we go. First of all, of course, we start off with the, you may have got the clue from the West African music, it's a look at Niger, and a couple of things to talk about here. First of all, the Nigerian military rulers proceeding rapidly in trying to establish a solid basis for their government. And somebody's just asked me an interesting question in the chat on Bhaskar Sankara's Socialist Manifesto. I will come back to you on that one. So, the Nigerian events, the Nigerian rulers, the military government now have moved to solidify their rule. They've appointed a new cabinet led by a civilian prime minister who was a former finance minister in a previous administration. They've also had a meeting with Victoria Fuck the EU Newland. That's about the only thing I do agree with her on. And she apparently arrived in the Nigerian capital, Niamey, with a promise of over $200 million to be paid in what appears to be, if this is true, some kind of bribe, basically. Which, given the crude nature of Newland and the State Department as it is run at the moment, it wouldn't surprise me if they did turn up with a $200 million in a suitcase and basically offer to buy off the generals. And apparently she was rebuffed. She was refused access to the overthrown president, and she was refused permission to see him. She didn't even see Chiani, the current president, the man who orchestrated the coup. So interesting that Newland was apparently rebuffed, and the military government is proceeding to try and solidify itself. It also has, if you believe the polling that's been published recently, over 70% of the Nigerian population support the coup government and support the action that it has taken so far, specifically the action against the French colonialists. So the manifestation of this support was seen in mass demonstrations in the Nigerian capital, and also a huge rally in one of the football stadiums there that was addressed by I believe General Chiani, now President Chiani, and several other military leaders. So this has struck a real chord with the Nigerian masses. And you have to say that you can't really be surprised, because the masses are always smarter than the bourgeoisie and the imperialists give them credit for. They know very well who's been shafting them for many, many years. And I'll give you a good example. The uranium trade in Niger, one that is dominated by French and Japanese and I do believe an Australian company, who've been mining intensively in the Nigerian uranium deposits for many, many years. And according to a report that was published in the Orinoco Tribune, which is a newspaper that's got some links with the PSUV in Venezuela, one of the Nigerian uranium mines was mined out by this French-Japanese consortium. So two imperialist countries coming together to shaft the Nigerian nation. It was mined out after over, I believe, 40 years of operation, and they just abandoned it. Now, I didn't know a lot about uranium mining, but apparently it's rather expensive to do safely, especially when a seam is mined out. It's hard to actually close this thing down safely. So instead of which, they've just abandoned ship, apparently. They left generation after generation of miners because the mining was done in very unsafe conditions. So if you're mining out uranium, you stand a pretty good chance, if you're not wearing proper protective equipment, of contracting various forms of radiation sickness or various forms of cancers, if you've been spending years and years mining it out. And of course, the French companies had no interest in providing proper safety equipment to Nigerian miners. So apparently there's thousands and thousands of men who've worked in this place left with cancers and other conditions related to the long-term handling of uranium in its rock-type form as they burrow it out of the ground. And all the land around it is polluted, and the whole area that was built up around it has been left without any economic assistance. So you've got a bunch of terminally ill old miners left to rot in this old mining town, but when the company had decided that it was either too expensive to continue mining there or the seam had been mined out. Now that's a familiar story with mining operations all over the world under capitalism. I mean, if you went around the county I'm originally from, Derbyshire, back into the 90s, you'd have found whole homes full of old miners dealing with all kinds of medical conditions who'd been left to rot, basically, when the state closed down all the mines. And of course you can find depressed mining towns all the way across the north of England, but in an even more extreme fashion in terms of what has happened to these ex-miners in Niger. So that's one look at the effects of the wonderful gifts of French neo-colonialism that they've left to the Nigerians. The other issue that has motivated the coup is, of course, along with the exploitation of Niger's resources, the fact that over 70% of the population doesn't have access to electricity. The average life expectancy is 52. The illiteracy rate is around about 80%. And you can tell that people are going to be pissed off. And that can't help but work its way into even the forces of the state, which is why the revolt in the military was led by this officer corps, many of whom were, of course, trained in the United States, principally the United States, but also France. And again, as I've said before, this happens quite a lot. This happens in many colonial or colonized nations, that the military officers who have been trained by the colonizer turn on the colonizer because, of course, they have a connection also with the Nigerian masses. And because it's a colonized nation that lacks the class hierarchy in the form that the imperialist countries have it, they are still more linked to the masses of their nations than the officer corps would be in the British Army, for instance, or the American Army. So they can't help but be radicalized by the situation. And what has clearly happened is that the effects of the long-term hyper-exploitation of the country, combined with the long-term war triggered by jihadism, or by the Salafist jihadists in the Sahel region, which, remember, the Sahel region is that long strip across northern Central Africa along mostly desert lands in Mali and Niger and Chad, which has been plagued by various jihadist groups staging insurgencies for many, many years now. And of course, this was all part of the narrative of the war on terror not so long ago. Remember the war on terror? It was really big in the 2000s. And you take a step back and you look at what's happened to countries like Mali and Niger and Chad as well. And you can see that the way in which the terror threat, so to speak, was dealt with or not dealt with by the United States and the French and others wasn't about actually eliminating jihadism or its various sources. It was actually about sustaining colonial control, which is why, of course, the French were more than happy to see the jihadist threat continue. This is why, of course, they had no real interest in ending the jihadist insurgency. Neither did the Americans, who, as we all know, have got extensive links, not just with the various Salafist groups that have plagued places like Libya and, of course, Syria for many, many years, but, of course, they have extensive links in the form of intelligence agency links with the countries that provide a lot of the funding for these jihadist organizations, namely the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. So, at the very least, they were perfectly happy to see the insurgencies in Mali and Niger and Chad and other places and Nigeria grow and grow at a more, shall we say, active angle of involvement. We could say that they have been at least indirectly involved in aiding these insurgencies because having them there is very useful. It keeps the government under control. It allows you to insert security forces on the grounds that you have to put them there to battle terrorism. Despite the fact that the French have been there for 10 years and all the terrorism across Mali, Niger, Chad and other places has only got worse. There was an article recently that studied the number of attacks and the territory held by the Islamists in Mali, for instance, since the French intervention and the American intervention in the early 2010s. And the situation's got worse. So either the French and American armed forces are utter crap and can't beat back a bunch of jihadists, or it was never about fighting the jihadists in the first place. It was about finding an excuse to keep forces there, to keep the gold deposits and uranium deposits and any oil deposits under control. And you can dial up the Islamist insurgency or dial it down a little bit, depending upon what you want to do. And the rulers of the country have probably a pretty good idea, because all these people do have some kind of intelligence services. They probably have a pretty good idea that the imperialist countries are having something to do with the insurgency, but they're all too weak and too useless until now to actually step up and do something about it. It was when, of course, the coups in Guinea and Burkina Faso took hold and the French were evicted and the Russians came in, and this is also true in the Central African Republic, and they began to actually turn around the military situation and actually enable the local armies to win victories over the Islamists, that suddenly the spell was broken. The Western militaries weren't fighting the jihadists at all, not really. They were staging battles against them. They were making sure that they didn't take over the whole country. But to repeat what I said earlier, if you've got a jihadist insurgency that you can have some control over, you can make sure it gets more weapons, or you can make sure it gets less. You can make sure it gets funding, or you can make sure its funding is heavily restricted and or cut off. And if you really want to go for it, you can make sure it gets all the weapons it could possibly need, together with air support, and it can take over the country. And this is what they've been doing. This is the nature, this is the real story of the war on terror. Yes, they bombed and killed a lot of people, but of course, why did they do it? What were they actually aiming to do? And the answer is, as with anything else, that all of these so-called wars on something over the last 50 years have all been about maintaining supremacy in colonized nations, or, in the case of the war on drugs and the Nixon administration, using it as a means to batter recalcitrant areas of the United States into submission. Because, just to take a brief detour into the war on drugs, the heroin epidemic that swept into the United States in the late 60s and early 70s, well, where did that heroin, or most of it, come from? It came from the so-called Golden Triangle, which was a opium growing and heroin production operation that the CIA was running in Thailand and Vietnam, and was being shipped to the United States for profits to fund dodgy CIA operations inside Vietnam itself, and Laos and Cambodia, and of course with several CIA men taking a cut of the profits as well. And so the heroin wave that Nixon was so concerned about was started in large part by an American government agency. The crack wave in the 1980s, as we know from the reporting of Gary Webb, who mysteriously committed suicide by shooting himself twice in the back of the head, was started by the CIA in alliance with the Contras from Nicaragua. They were smuggling cocaine into Los Angeles and having it distributed to LA street gangs and across the country. And of course, they fueled the crack epidemic, which they then declared they needed a crackdown for, and threw loads of people who dealt this shit into jail. But of course, it was them that created it in the first place. Same with the poppy fields of Afghanistan. The CIA and MI6 and the American and British empires are, and have always been, empires which have engaged in mass drug trafficking. Then they declare they need a crackdown on it. Now, I go into that digression because this is how they always operate. And so when they say, oh, well, you've got a jihadist problem and we need to come in there and set up a military base and fly drones out of your country, it's a pretty good bet that they are behind the jihadist problem, one way or another. Because, again, this has now been proved, thanks to all the links they had to the moderate rebels in Syria, to the insurgency that destroyed the Gaddafi government, together with NATO air power in Libya. And so we know they've got very well established links to jihadist organizations, and where these organizations end and the Saudi or Qatari or UAE state begins is a rather blurry line, as we know from several of the 9/11 hijackers having extensive links to Saudi intelligence. So this is known. These are known facts. These are known facts within the countries concerned. If I can put this together all the way up in Manchester, someone in Niger, in Mali and other places, they know this very well, because they know the country and they know who's ultimately going to be moving the pieces on the board here. And so that this would erupt and that it would be popularly supported, and that the idea of getting rid of the French and getting rid of the Americans would be incredibly popular, should be no surprise to anybody. Again, I always go back to the work of Mao when it comes to the wisdom of the masses. Yes, the masses can't spontaneously go to revolutionary consciousness on their own, but the masses know an awful lot. They know an awful lot because they are the ones living and working in the nation. They know how the country works. They know how their communities work. They know how their workplaces function. They understand a lot of things that the revolutionaries, possibly those coming from the cities, do not. And those of us on the outside do not, because the masses have a certain wisdom to them. That's why you should be among the masses and learn from them. And that they would support the Nigerian coup and the overthrow of the supposed great Democrat, the great democratically elected government, is no surprise, because of course what had that government done? If you look at the reasons given by Tiani and others of the Nigerien junta for the overthrow of Mohamed Bazoum, you can see clearly what they're talking about, which is that they say that Bazoum had been pretending that the country had been going forward for years when it was being looted, had been lying to the population, or trying to lie to the population about the security situation, that the living standards of the country was deteriorating rapidly and it was going to fall apart. And if you look at the statistics about life expectancy, literacy, electrification, the amount of calories in the diet of the Nigerian people, you can see that what Tiani and the other generals said was true. So how should we regard then military coups of this nature that come along? Well, the answer is that not all coups are the same. There are coups which are there to restore the control of neocolonialism, such as the coup that was launched by French imperialism with Blaise Compaoré as their agent in place in Burkina Faso, which is the coup that in 1987 killed Thomas Sankara. And so, of course, that is a reactionary coup. However, the coups in Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Mali and Niger, these are, on the whole, progressive. Because what are they trying to do? Their stated aims, and of course backed up by what they have worked towards, what people like Traoré have worked towards in Burkina Faso, what Tiani says his aims are in Mali. Well, what their aims are is the eviction of the colonialists and the economic development of the country, to the point where Sankara's old dream of being a genuinely independent, but being a genuine sovereign nation, can be realized. And that's a vision that all of these guys who've been involved in these coups in these countries seem to share, that they can rid themselves of neo-colonialism, they can rid themselves of the French occupier and the American occupier, and they can pursue a course of independent development, doing deals as they are trying to do with the Russians and the Chinese and anybody else who will give them fair terms. Now, what is the response of the EU to this? Predictable. It's to threaten to basically sanction Niger into starvation and collapse. So that's your beloved EU. And this was an EU official who made this statement just today. So I have to laugh at this in a way, because we got, to digress just into British affairs for a moment, all these people, they call them Ramonas in Britain, the Romaniac people, the people who never got over losing the referendum over the EU in 2016. And I remember in 2016 that there was a group called Trade Unionists Against the EU, rather mixed bag, but they published some good stuff. And they published a really good paper on the trade unionist case against the EU, focusing on what the EU did to workers in Africa. And of course, they cited the famous case of how in places like Kenya, which are big sources of agricultural products, the EU's trade deals don't even allow the Kenyans to actually process the beans. The beans are sent raw and unprocessed to France and Italy, where they're turned into a commodity. They're just the African nations are just allowed to grow it, pick it, then you got to send it to Europe. You can't add any value to it yourself. And that's the trick of so-called globalization, which is they outsource all of the back-breaking labor elsewhere and then put the finishing touches to a product to turn it into a commodity that can go on the shelf in Europe or in the United States. And that's what the EU's done. If you read about how the EU has treated fishermen who operate off the coasts of East Africa, EU companies that are scamming them for their wages, you can see what the role of the EU is. In Africa, it's a neo-colonial project, which is why, of course, when you get the CFA franc zone operating in the old French colonies, it is, of course, now heavily influenced by the fact that it's a European-wide currency now, and so the CFA franc is linked to the euro, and the interest rates are, of course, decided upon the euro from the European Central Bank. So you get things that are directly affecting your country if you're Burkinabe or Malian or Nigerian, like interest rates, which are set in Brussels thousands and thousands of miles away for the benefit of European bankers. So it goes to show that, Nkrumah was exactly right when he talked about the severe limitations that were put on the independence of many African nations, in that it was going to be basically flag independence only. It was a huge step forward, and it was a product of a heroic struggle that was waged, or many heroic struggles that were waged by leaders of the African liberation movement, but it was limited by its very nature. And now you're seeing a new generation of African leaders rebel against that limited independence, because if you don't control your own currency, if you don't control your own interest rates, if your gold reserves are all taken to the Central Bank of France, if your trade policy is dictated by the fact that your currency basically is designed to only allow you to export to France or the rest of the EU, then you're not independent on any conceivable level. You have a government, you have a state apparatus which is funded by trade with the colonizing power. You have the colonizing power still militarily dominating you, and all of your economy is designed around and being an export market for the colonizer, and of course the colonizer's true master in the United States. So it is no wonder that you have a new generation rebelling against this, and it is entirely right that they rebel against this. And as long as these military governments are going in the direction of rebelling against colonialism, rejecting US imperialism, and of course the EU imperialism, this should be supported. And to go back to the subject of the British left and the EU, most of the British left spent years screaming that Brexit was racist and the EU was this great progressive institution that should be supported, otherwise we'd be encouraging racism. Well, again, just look at how the EU actually treats the African nations. You get half these morons in Britain waving EU flags saying take the knee for Black Lives Matter and fanatically supporting an institution in the EU which makes sure that the life expectancy of black African workers is 52. Does that make sense? Well, only in the bizarre hall of mirrors that is bourgeois ideology in Britain today. But it is undoubtedly a progressive event that is going on in Niger right now. It is supported by the masses. I hope that Chiani and the others can find a way around EU sanctions. I'm pretty sure they can ask the Russians for some advice on that. And if they rally the masses behind them, go among the masses, learn from them, build support from the base of the country upwards, and if they can unify the great masses of the nation behind them, it will put off ECOWAS and others from intervening in Niger, because the French and the Americans won't want to do the dirty work themselves. They'll want to get Tinubu, the drug dealer and money launderer from Chicago, who's become Nigerian president. They'll want the Nigerians to go and die for them. And if they're faced with a nation that's going to resist en masse, then even Tinubu isn't going to fancy those odds. So it looks like so far that what the EU is going to favor is trying to collapse the Nigerian state via the imposition of sanctions. And I'll put a solid bet on now that the Americans are trying to whip up their jihadist stooges in Niger and other countries to wage a new round of war upon the people of those nations. And just like fascist forces in Europe, just like jihadist forces and other forms of religious reactionary all over the world, these jihadist operations in the Sahel, these should be talked about for what they are, and we should explain to the working classes in our own countries what they are, which is that these are stooges of imperialism, that these are employees of the French, the British, the Americans, the Italians, the Germans. These are the knuckle draggers and the lunatics who imperialism relies upon to help enforce its will in these countries. And that should be part of our messaging to the workers, because we've got to expose the war on terror rhetoric that sought to paint all these people in the colonized nations as Islamic fanatics, etc. And we need to reverse that and say, no, the Islamic fanatics are actually working for the British government. They are the British government's enforcers. And yes, they might bomb them every now and again, but the British government's always done that. I mean, just look how they acted in the occupied 6 counties of Ireland. They used to, they employed the services of loyalist paramilitaries for decade upon decade, and they locked up a lot of them and killed some of them. They still kept working with them, though. And so the relationship between the imperialist countries and their enforcers in the colonized nations is always one that is back and forth, push and pull, sometimes closer cooperation, sometimes slightly less cooperation, sometimes open aggression. But they always go back to each other and always deal with each other. And that's the reality of it. So keep an eye on events in Niger. Make sure that I take the opportunity whenever it comes up in conversation to put out a correct version of events before workers. Workers should understand, politicized workers should be helped to understand the situation there and why it does directly impact upon us here, and why we should welcome the African nations ridding themselves of neo-colonial domination, because that is something that is ultimately going to help us build a revolution, so-called neoconservatism, and various other things, including engineered recessions. So the comments that have come in so far. So yeah, any thoughts on Bhaskar Sankara's Socialist Manifesto? Well, I'm going to be completely fair, Burke Fay. I haven't read it. Now, it looks awful. I read a few pages of it when it came out, and it made me want to throw up. Now, if there's a popular demand that I read that and respond to it, then I will do. So if you want me to read and respond to Bhaskar Sankara's Socialist Manifesto, I will do so. So make your feelings known in the chat. Search and Research says, love the music. The US Department of State says, in 74, Marxist-Leninism was declared the guiding philosophy in Benin. Yes, it was. 74 to 1990, it was a socialist state. And I need to do more research into exactly how that started and how it ended, but it's a revolution I didn't know a lot about. The other, of course, would be the revolutionary process in Madagascar, which was actually called the Socialist Republic for quite a long time. Neocon Cookie Monster, exactly. Hello to my comrade Naylor. Hello to Ben. DE says, Tulsi Gabbard has been active in Africa lately. Yeah, well, that's a very good a case of controlled opposition there, you know. She's the great opponent of the deep state who works in the intelligence agencies. Just like old, what's his name, Jack Posobiec, as a former naval intelligence man. Definitely not a current asset. Definitely not. So, moving on then to talk about a couple of other things. The word neocon, I mean, this was just a brief follow-on from the discussion about neoliberalism the other day. Yeah, and CJ in the Telegram discussion group asked this. And yeah, it's to be regarded in the same way. The term neocon is used to, of course, refer to the Bush administration principally, and others like Newland who've served in every kind of administration. And it's meant to draw this big distinction between the supposed foreign policy realists, people like Henry Kissinger, and those who immediately followed after him, like Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, etc., who are meant to represent a more aggressive form of American imperialism. Now, I'm not sure. I've never bought into this idea that the idea that that somehow there was this great difference between the activities of American imperialism pre Rumsfeld, Cheney, etc., and the Reagan administration, and post them. I mean, if you look at the activities of US imperialism in places like Central America and South America, and all the coups and bloodletting they engaged in there, there's no real difference between what went on in the 50s and what went on in the 80s. Just, probably a higher level of brutality, but pretty consistent brutality. And the idea that the Johnson administration was in somehow better than the Reagan administration or was managing things differently. Remember, the Johnson administration, along with the Harold Wilson administration of Britain, organized the massacre of 1.5 million Indonesians in order to literally kill every single member that they could find of the Indonesian Communist Party. So that's your foreign policy realists. That's the pre-neocon people who were supposed to be better, according to some. So the change is that, of course, the neocons cite a slightly different selection of intellectual references. So like Henry Kissinger will be going on about Bismarck and balance of power, etc., etc. And were the people like Elliot Abrams more aggressive? Well, they were more upfront about it. That's one thing. And of course, post the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were able to be more openly aggressive about things. But there's no fundamental change. Again, just like with neoliberalism being a word that Keynesians and social democrats used to disguise the changes in the evolution of the capitalist system over the years, and how the class struggle changed it, and how the crisis of imperialism made the situation more desperate for capital. It needed to go on ever more brutal attacks. So is the same when it comes to questions of foreign interventions, etc. The term neocon doesn't really tell us anything about, well, why these people are doing things. What is the motivation? Why did the behavior of US imperialism get ever more aggressive and ever more brutal? And the term neocon implies it's just down to a set of bad ideas. But ideas are generated from a material base, of course. And of course, the need for American imperialism to be more aggressive in its pushing back against socialist countries, that stems from the fact that American imperialism and indeed British imperialism had entered a crisis in the middle 1960s. That they needed to destroy socialism in all its forms in order to get themselves out of it, to effectively open up areas of the world for ultra and hyper exploitation, so super profits could be extracted from it. And all that is the reason why the behavior of American imperialism got even more aggressive, even though I would say the level of brutality remains pretty consistent. And there was a period where they had to not engage in open military aggression against the Warsaw Pact. But of course they didn't engage in open military aggression against the Warsaw Pact, but they did, of course, arm, fund and train the Banderist insurgency in Ukraine, which killed hundreds of thousands of people after World War II. So again, like, where is this big difference between the so-called neocons and the so-called realists? I mean, this is the same system. It just has slightly different intellectual touchstones, more Leo Strauss, less Otto von Bismarck. And the people probably get dumber over time. But people who insist on using the term neocon to describe this project that's gone on in Ukraine, well, they're missing the trick. They're missing what's really going on. The Ukrainian project, for instance, it's been generated by the fact that the interests of American imperialism dictate that the Russian Federation that survived the collapse of 1991, of course, survived it too much intact. So again, this is the useful thing about the modern era. The useful thing about people like Paul Wolfowitz was the fact that they were a little bit more honest in their internal documents than the previous generation were. They were honest about the need to break up, from the perspective of American imperialism, that is, break up Russia, loot its resources, make sure it was crippled and surrounded by military bases, and promote insurgencies within it. That they are all very, very open about. And of course, they're increasingly desperate, so they're even more open about it now. But again, the term neocon doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you why American imperialism has got more aggressive, and it doesn't tell you why or what contradictions are generating that. It's just it's an idealism using that term. It's a way of masking the true nature of American imperialism by pretending it just comes from a set of bad ideas or a set of bad intellectuals or bad political actors like Victoria Nuland, ignoring what generates people like that, what generates the policies that American imperialism follows, and that is, of course, the crisis of American imperialism and its need to try and break up and destroy the largest countries in the world, mainly Russia and China these days. So yeah, I reject the usage of the word neocon. I never use it myself. It's like I don't use the word neoliberal unless I'm talking about it in an academic sense. It's a term which promotes idealism and a false understanding of things. You need to be giving things their real names, talking to workers about what imperialism is, not saying neocon this or that or the other or neoliberal. No, call it what it is. Call it British imperialism. Explain what it is. Explain how its behavior is generated by the crisis and the rot of imperialism and why this is a crisis that has lasted for over a century. Call things what they are. Use simple language to describe these often complex processes. You take inspiration from the writings of Stalin, who could boil down often complex messages into quite succinct pamphlets that could be used for the education of workers. All these fancy terms that academics and liberals and other critics of the US system come up with, all are ways of dancing around what is the obvious central contradiction, which is the imperialist system itself. Okay, somebody does want me to respond to Bhaskar Sunkara. Okay, will I be debating Vladimir Ishenko? I'll get back to you on that one. I need to read more of his writings first before I commit to it. Hello to Paul. Hello to Kent. Ben says, all the nations that most crushed under neocolonialism see most clearly that Russia is fighting imperialism. Is there a reference that describes the countries most crushed under neocolonialism? Well, you can go through the World Bank data and see it pretty clearly. It's a good point, actually. We could do with a reference point for it. Let me take a note on that one to see if there is anything on it and come back to you. Because the data's there, but to summarize it inside a leaflet might be useful. So, moving on to discuss our next item on the agenda. And that is, of course, talking about engineered recessions. And I'm just going to go briefly into this. Because, of course, the British economy has been stagnating for many, many years. And now I'm going to pause and do something very English and sip some tea. And, of course, the reason for this, as I've said many times, is the crash in 2008, which was itself a manifestation of a long-term crisis of capitalism that began arguably in the middle 1960s. Or you could say it was, like I was saying a moment ago, another manifestation of a 100-year-long crisis of imperialism. Either way, the British economy domestically has been stagnating for a long time, kept afloat by ever-growing amounts of fake money that the Bank of England just creates on a spreadsheet. So a recession has been essentially the reality, or a long depression has been the reality for a long, long time for millions upon millions of workers in this country and in the United States as well, and in most of Europe. And so getting to the point that we are at now, where, of course, inflation was running much higher, and the official rate was around about 8% for a long time, but in reality, I think it was over 10, and has been for a long time, given the way that prices have gone up. So this is, of course, something which the employers and their government are aware of and are now actively looking for a way out of, because this stagnation's gone on for a long time. Workers, of course, start demanding higher wages. So you get Bank of England functionaries and thinkers in the Financial Times start to talk about the need to have a recession. And I've talked about this a little bit before. But now it looks like they're going to get their wish. And of course, the trade union leaders have, with their usual impeccable timing, surrendered and completely demoralized the working class just in time for the recession to really begin. So thank you, Dave Ward and others, for that one, almost as if they're doing it deliberately. But the point here is that an engineered recession is a possible thing, because we know now, because they've been talking about it in the open, and it's always been possible. It's always been possible to want to do this sort of Joseph Schumpeter style creative destruction, as he called it. The idea that capitalism is such a brilliant system because even in the destruction of large amounts of capital and labor, mostly through recession, depression, the annihilation or liquidation of large amounts of capital, or through war, capitalism through that destructive process can create even better profits and even better new technologies, etc. It is endlessly innovative. I think the opposite is true now. It is endlessly wasteful. But now you've got Hugh Pill, one of the chief economists in the Bank of England, coming out into the open and saying we need a recession. You've got the Financial Times saying it. It's clear that this is the move they are going to make. And in their eyes, they start a recession. The unemployment figures shoot through the roof. Rishi Sunak and the Tories carry the can for it, but it doesn't matter because they've got Keir Starmer to come in and essentially then make sure that the working class is ground down even further. Because, of course, one of the things they need to do in this crisis, where they are running the risk now through what we've just been discussing with regard to Niger and other places, they're running the risk of being pushed out of some of these areas where they've actually profited from the hyper-exploitation of the labour and the resources there. And so what's their way out? Well, they keep talking about reindustrialization. The American ruling class do. You see a recent speech by that streak of piss Jake Sullivan talking about how outsourcing was wrong. We need to bring back production. Of course, he's got a big job on because China outproduces the United States on just about every single conceivable metric now, including on shipbuilding with regard to military vessels as well. American shipbuilding industry is basically fucked and has been in a long-term decline for a very long time, along with quite a lot of the rest of American industry. So to actually turn that around in the United States or in Britain, you would need to do two things. You would need to inject a gigantic amount of money via the state into an industry like steel or shipbuilding or something else that is regarded as essential for war production, which is what they're all thinking about at the moment. And then you would, of course, need a workforce that would be willing to be, or at least could be forced into hyper-exploitation, because you would want this to be run profitably as well. And you can't just underwrite it all with the state. There's got to be a certain organic composition of capital there, meaning human labour, or profit from human labour. So how do you do that? I mean, if you were trying to employ people to build ships in Britain today, you'd have to have highly skilled people. And they could, of course, demand a reasonable rate for their services. Well, one of the ways in which you can make sure that higher wages aren't demanded is having a massive reserve army of labour, which is traditional for capitalism. It's only after World War II and, of course, the influence of the Soviet Union and the need by the capitalists that the capitalists had to show some reforms that they had to go into the area of supporting full employment. And traditionally, though, they've been happy to maintain on the edge of life and death the massive reserve army of labour. And if they manage to create that again, and they will use that then to, of course, decimate the bargaining power of the working class and go after the working class in such a way as to make reindustrialization profitable again. And that is the way that they will seek to do this. Whether they seek to do it across the whole nation at the same time, or whether they try and do it via special economic zones, which we know that they're playing with already, that's an open question. But it's certainly something that they are considering. And when they're talking about an engineered recession, that's their ultimate motivation, to decimate the bargaining power of the working class and ensure that whatever reindustrialization they do need to do for the coming war with China, for instance, is done on a profitable basis and is done without the interference of those pesky trade unions, which, even though they are led by the most useless selection of tossers known to man, could still pose a problem if new trade unions emerged amongst radicalized sections of the working class. They've got to make sure that they are able to use the traditional reserve army of labour in order to make sure that the working class remains compliant. And that is what they are after here. That, and of course, more broadly, they do take that Schumpeterian view, or that view of Andrew Mellon back in the day, that they have to purge the system of its rottenness, that they've let this quantitative easing thing go on for far too long, and that now it's time to actually settle accounts with the working class and purge the system and restore profitability through destruction of capital, destruction of labor. And of course, if that goes along with a massive imperialist war in a few years' time, well, not many of these people would complain. So these are the dangers that we have in front of us at the moment. So I wanted to emphasize that just briefly. I can talk more about that in the future, of course. So thing I wanted to sort of round off on tonight was, of course, this talk of the American dream, referencing the now famous video that circulated of the woman in her car talking about, well, where has it gone? Well, it's a great line from the late American comedian George Carlin, who said, it's called the American dream because you've got to be asleep to believe it. But one thing I did want to talk about was connected to this, which is, well, where did it come from? Of course, there's various different iterations of the American dream, but one thing I think all of them have in common is the idea not just of being rich, but the idea of escaping the class contradictions, being outside of the class war, being freed of want, for instance, having enough that you don't have to worry about where the next meal's going to come from. And this ultimately does come from the original period of independence, the early independence period in the United States, from the time of the model being the yeoman farmer. That's what, of course, the likes of Jefferson or even Tom Paine were thinking about when they declared that the U.S. federal government would be this minimal state. Jeffersonian democracy, so to speak, is based on the idea of the medium-sized property owner. Marx comments when writing in the 1850s that one of the reasons why factory wages were higher, considerably higher for a while in the United States, was because the workers tended to go through factories, make a little bit of money, and then go and try and set themselves up on an independent farmstead out in, well, land that somebody else had been evicted from often. But that was, of course, one of the aspects of the American dream, the idea in the early period that you could be part of this sort of Jeffersonian democracy by owning a decent bit of land, building your own farmhouse, raising your own cattle, and being freed from wage labor. And that's, of course, what a lot of the early American radicalism is based around. American petty bourgeois radicalism still harks back to that. That's what the libertarians, a lot of them anyway, harken back to, the idea that there could be this space for yourself outside of the class contradictions that plagued the homelands back in old Europe. And you can see a lot of literature in 19th century America making exactly that point. A lot of the sort of idealist anarchism in 19th century America, who like Henry David Thoreau, they held this view. I think Thoreau's utopian novel is about his experiences living by a pond in a place called Walden, I think it was, where the idea being that you could escape out into the country, you could escape the town and the city, and you could find a place in the wilderness to be free of the urban life and all that it brought, and of course free from the state. And this is a big thing that remains present, it seems to me, in American sort of libertarian radicalism. And of course, the other aspect of it was, of course, the idea that not only could you be free of class contradictions, but there was no aristocracy in America, that anybody could break into the ruling class. So that's another aspect of it. You know, what was it? The old line that Hunter S. Thompson said over and over again: pure Horatio Alger stuff. The rags to riches storyteller from I think he's from the 19th century. And of course, that's part of it as well. The idea that anybody can be rich. And the idea that, you know, to go back to Max Weber, a bit of Protestant ethic, and you can break yourself free from any constraints, that you will be rewarded for putting in long hours at work. I mean, there's an infamous piece of footage from the George W. Bush era where he's talking to this woman who says she's got free jobs or something, and he goes, "Free jobs? Isn't that great? Only in America." And of course, what has come about over the years is that more and more people are waking up to the fact that this just simply isn't true. I mean, it was always untrue. I mean, you could argue that in the Jeffersonian period, you could, as a factory worker, save up a bit of money, buy a bit of land, and then escape the city that way. So perhaps that had some truth to it. But the idea that you can, just by working 96 hours a week or something, that you can now reap your rewards of sacrifice and hard work now so that your children would benefit later, all of that, of course, is going by the by. And it's obvious to everybody now. I mean, Donald Trump wouldn't have got the votes that he did if more and more people, even in the petty bourgeoisie, couldn't see that. And it's interesting that this is becoming more and more obvious. And of course, you would have to be a fool. Go back to what I was saying about the masses in the African nations. The American masses know very well that they're being taken for a ride. That this idea, this old idea that, partly rooted in Jeffersonianism, partly rooted in the old Protestant ethic, partly rooted in the idea of this society without an aristocracy, they can see that there's the equivalent of an aristocracy. They can see who the ruling class are. The American masses can. They can see that they're working, 40, 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week, 70 hours a week, often working 2 jobs. And they can also see that their children will be poorer than they are, because they are poorer than their parents. And so this myth, which has been quite effective in ruling class propaganda in the United States, is, of course, grinding itself down. And how the American masses react to this is going to be interesting. Of course, a lot of it depends upon whether communist parties can be built in the United States, whether a communist party can be built on a national level to channel this frustration in the right way. Because, of course, there is always the risk that some fascist organization can rise out of the American bourgeoisie and rally a section of the American petty bourgeois as the system goes into crisis, and they need to attack the working class with ever greater aggression. So the national mythology, a key part of the national mythology of the leading imperialist power coming to a close, is an interesting development, and one that we should, of course, pay careful attention to, and to be able to analyze where this American dream came from, what it was rooted in, the historical reality it was rooted in, and why the American ruling class has sold this mythology for so long, and why it's coming to a close. And of course, for the overwhelming majority of the American working class, this isn't something which is going to come back. The modern iteration of the American dream, of course, has many different variations upon it. One, of course, comes through the sort of libertarians, as I've already discussed. The other is more reflected in what you might call the Reaganite base of the Republican Party. The other part of it is, of course, related to FDR's New Deal, because that was sold by American liberals and social democrats as part of the American dream, helping realize the American dream. And you can see rhetoric from the time of the building of the New Deal reflected that. And of course, that's bullshit too, and that's falling apart. So you've got all these different versions of the American dream and political projects related to it, and economic projects related to it, which is all falling apart now. And the only thing that American capitalism has to offer the American worker now is ever-increasing rates of exploitation and ever-growing poverty. And again, it points to the need for an American Communist Party to emerge out of this, because it sure as hell ain't the pathetic remnants of the CPUSA, which is currently just a vote Democrat operation. So there's an interesting development, and one that we certainly should keep an eye on. Now, coming up to about an hour we've been going for now. I've worked through the agenda for tonight. Tomorrow night will be the previously promised episode on the Mao Zedong work from the 1930s, which is entitled On the Correct Handling of Contradictions Among the People. So I'll be doing that tomorrow, and that will be from 8 until 10. That's scheduled in for. So I hope you'll join me for that. We've got a comment come in here. Search and Research says, it's common for many Americans who were against the Iraq War to refer to the architects as neocons. An eye-opener for some when shown the same are behind Ukraine, i.e. Newland, her husband, Pinak. Yes, that many of them are in the permanent state are behind all of it. But again, the neocon word doesn't tell you why. It doesn't tell you why they did Iraq. When people describe the neocons, they describe them as having bad ideas or that they're ultra-militarist and aggressive. Well, yes, all of that is true, but the neocon word doesn't tell you anything about why they are. Why did the Bush administration choose to invade Iraq? Well, they were continuing the policy of the Clinton administration. Why was the Clinton administration pursuing it? Well, they were pursuing the same policy as the George Bush Sr. administration. What was he after? Well, George Bush Sr. announced a New World Order in the early 1990s, I believe it was in 1992, and said that America needed to lead it. And what does he mean by that? What was the project there? Well, it's the same project that made them go after Yugoslavia. And that project is ultimately the need of American imperialism to first annihilate the states that were in the non-aligned movement, like places like Iraq, places like Yugoslavia, which weren't strictly in either camp in the Cold War, and make sure that they were firmly brought over to the American side for the benefits of American capitalists being able to hyper-exploit them. And that all comes from the fact that, of course, America was given a huge gift by the revisionists in their treacherous collapse of the Soviet Union, but that American imperialism is in this deep crisis and has been for a long time. Talking about neocons, etc., again, this focuses on the personnel and this focuses on ideas. It doesn't make clear the forces behind it, just the same way that neoliberalism is a term that everybody from Donald Trump to Bhaskar Sunkara can use. And again, it doesn't explain things. We need to be explaining what the force behind all of this is, which is, of course, American imperialism, British imperialism, French imperialism. And all these words that make it look as if what these people are suffering from is just an expression of bad ideas, well, that doesn't help us. It doesn't help us. We can explain why the people like Newland hang around for so long and why they're members of administration after administration after administration and what the deep state is, which is, of course, a very real thing. But, of course, we need to explain this within the context of an American empire and one that is in decay. So, where are we? Hello to Munis. Yeah, we have come in just at the end, mate. We're reaching the end of the hour, so I'm going to call it a day there. I hope that you got something out of this. I hope that you will join me at tomorrow night at 8 p.m. And as again, I will say that the text we'll be doing then is Mao on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. Please join me for that. I will be back again, as I said, at 8 tomorrow. And I will say thank you to everybody who's contributed to the chat tonight. Hello to Peter, Terry, Harry, Lee, Irish Partisan, Chris Bernardle, DE, Burke Fay, Search and Research, Naylor, DE, Kent, Paul Chiaro, Pablo, Chris Bernardle, hello to Gidney N. Cloyd. Okay, so thank you to everybody. I'll be back again tomorrow.
De la révolution populaire du Bénin, nous avons répondu présent. Nous sommes venus nombreux femmes et hommes, cadres du Bénin, unifier notre pensée et notre action pour donner à notre chère patrie l'espoir d'une société où il fera bon vivre grâce au socialisme scientifique guidé par le marxisme léniniste. Debout, patriotes béninois, je sais